15.
Today, I'm going to be presenting on how far can data take us in solving the housing crisis. First, a bit of background on who I am and how I got interested in this fairly ambitious question. So last fall, I took a really excellent course called The Foundations of New York City that is put on by an independent civic school called Maximum New York. Highly recommend for anyone interested in learning more about how New York City works. We spent a lot of time talking about the zoning resolution and New York City zoning history. And while we were learning about zoning, this was happening against the backdrop of the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity hearings. And so I was listening to a lot of the testimonies about City of Yes, and something that really struck me was it seems like everyone agrees that we're definitely in a housing crisis and we're definitely in an affordability crisis. But notably, we're not in consensus about what to do to get out of this crisis. So that was the entry point for my research. And what I was really curious about was how exactly can we study this question of how to get out of the housing crisis empirically? Like, to what extent can data give us the answers to this question? So something I want to note is that my professional background is in software engineering and machine learning. Notably, I am not experienced in economics, housing policy, or data science. And I say this not to undermine what I'm going to say, but really to emphasize that I'm coming at this from like the vantage point of an outsider who was really learning how to think about this problem and how to think about housing research from the ground up and build a mental framework for this problem. And that's really my goal for what I want to impart in this talk is like an epistemology for how we can think about housing research. So, like I mentioned, it's a pretty ambitious question and we only have an hour. I'm a little concerned about information overload. I want to have everyone like save your questions till the end, and if for some reason we run out of time, I'll share my email and would love to continue the conversation over email. Starting with my kind of initial research impulse, I was looking at the complexity of our zoning resolution, and I was thinking about how do we study the impact of zoning changes on rent prices. So my initial research question was, what if we could build a machine learning model to predict the impact of zoning changes on rent prices? As I started investigating how to make this a reality, I realized that the main constraining factor here was going to be the lack of data. For one, I was not able to find a standardized lot level data set on rents. And in terms of zoning data, there is a lot of kind of historical data on zoning amendments, but a lot of it was in unstructured text or PDF formats, and converting this data to a machine readable format or a tabular format in and of itself is a pretty meaningful task. But I decided to give it a shot, and so I started working on this problem of zoning classification. So I used the zoning text amendments index and the zoning map amendments index, and I scraped all of the PDFs that refer to the zoning applications for each zoning change that we have access for. And I started using an LLM API to classify each of these zoning application PDFs into what type of zoning change it likely referred to. In this process of using LLMs to transform unstructured data into structured data is, I think, a pretty high leverage and possibly underutilized way for using LLMs. But as I started running this procedure on more and more zoning changes and looking at what data was coming out of this, I was realizing that the vast majority of the zoning changes that I was looking at were actually very small developer-initiated zoning changes. And so the problem that I was really facing was if I was going to try and train a machine learning model to predict the impact of zoning changes on something like rent prices or housing supply, there really weren't enough kind of large scale, meaningful examples of zoning changes that I could actually use to train this model on. So at this point, I realized, okay, my initial sort of assumptions about how we can study this problem were probably pretty naive. And so I took a step back and I decided to do a bunch of reading and figure out how housing research is typically approached. So before I dive into the housing research, I think it's going to be helpful to ground ourselves in a housing timeline of the history of kind of major events in New York City housing history. So in 1916, we got our initial zoning resolution, and this was a pretty modest set of zoning codes compared to what we currently have today. We didn't have zoning before this, and so having any zoning resolution at all was a reaction to a lot of problems like overcrowding, disease, lack of sunlight, basically unchecked urban density. And then in the 1920s, we had the kind of the biggest housing boom we've seen in the past 100 years. We saw over 740,000 housing units being built during this decade. And if you look at historical rent indices, you can also see that there were correlated rent decreases with the kind of great amount of supply during that decade. It isn't listed here, but in 1943, rent controls were introduced for the first time as a emergency wartime mechanism. So during World War II, in order to counteract the lack of construction of housing that was happening in the city, rent controls were introduced as a way to freeze the price of rents. In 1961, we got our second version of the zoning resolution, which is also our current version of the zoning resolution. And it's important to note that this was a massive downzoning of the city. So it's estimated that before 1961, the maximum population capacity of New York City was around 55 million. And after this downzoning, it was around 12 million. And really, there's a lot more history and nuance here that I'm glossing over, but the main cultural impulse behind this zoning change was a reaction against urban density, the idea that urban density was an evil that needed to be controlled and that the city should zone itself for stabilization rather than growth. The other important thing that we get in 1961 is the introduction of the concept of floor area ratio, or FAR, as you'll often hear it referred to. Floor area ratio is one of the main levers that is used in controlling the zoning of buildings. And what it means is basically the ratio of all of the area of the floors of a building to the area of its lot size. And a FAR is typically imposed as like a cap. So if you have a floor area ratio cap, then that limits how tall or how large your building can be, essentially. So in 1965, we got the Landmarks Law, which introduced the Landmarks Preservation Commission and a process by which we can designate landmarks or historic districts. And this is notable because landmarking in historic districts greatly restricts what you can do to a building, whether you can modify it or demolish it, etc. In 1969, rent stabilization laws were introduced, and as we most probably know, that basically sets a cap on the percentage increase of rents year over year for certain housing units. And then finally, in 2024, as we also know, the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity was passed, which was novel in that it represented a degree of intentional and equitable comprehensive planning for upregulating housing supply that we hadn't really seen, a scale of zoning change that we hadn't really seen since the 1960s. So the reason I wanted to give this kind of 100-year history overview is that I want to stress the point that there was no single decision that kind of led us to be in the housing crisis that we're in today. Rather, our current state is a product of the evolution of many historical, cultural, and political factors. Something else that I want to emphasize is the fact that Interestingly, New York City has legally been in a housing emergency for the past 80 years. So, what does this mean? So, I mentioned that in 1943, rent control was introduced as an emergency wartime mechanism to combat the lack of housing construction. This was meant to be a temporary measure, but the idea of rent regulation never really went away. In the 1970s, a New York state law was passed that declared that municipalities may enact a housing emergency if and only if the vacancy rates are less than 5%. And a housing emergency is the precondition for rent stabilization laws to be in effect. And ever since that law has been passed, City Council has been repeatedly renewing the housing emergency. To put this in simpler terms, our rent stabilization laws can only legally take effect if our vacancy rates are less than 5%. And we've been in this state of emergency legally for 80 years. And the point I want to stress here is if it seems strange that we've been in an emergency for 80 years, I think you're right to think that. But secondly, I think one could also look at, I didn't mention this is the graph of our vacancy rates over the past 100 years. One could look at this and maybe conclude that, oh, it's rent stabilization or it's rent regulations that are the cause of this kind of feedback loop of keeping us in a housing emergency. And to that, I would also stress that the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. Rent regulation is one of many variables that impact how much housing supply we can build. And so I would just stress that, again, just like with the context of our complex history, this is also just another one piece of the nuanced puzzle. Coming back to my own research journey, after I realized that my original impulse to build a machine learning model was probably pretty off, I started digging into how economics research literature works to understand what is a better way to think about studying the housing market. There are a few things that I realized. One thing that I realized was that a lot of the economics literature centers around causal inference studies rather than purely predictive models. Causal inference is basically a way to try and isolate treatment and control groups to see if you can link an outcome to what factors caused that outcome. The idealized version of a causal inference study is what you're probably familiar with, which is a randomized controlled trial where you have a treatment group and a control group, and maybe you're trying to study the impact of a certain medication on the treatment group. And so you control for all other factors like age, pre-existing conditions, etc., and see if you can isolate the impact of this medication on as the treatment. However, it's probably pretty intuitive why this type of kind of purely causal study is very difficult to do with something like a housing market, because obviously you can't run a policy experiment where you're isolating policy changes to just one neighborhood and controlling for all other factors and observing outcomes over time. That's simply not possible. So this is where in economics research, the idea of quasi-experimental observational studies come in. This is where researchers basically use a bunch of historical data to glean insights about causality and use sort of random interventions or different sort of quirks and changes of these variables to make some assumptions about what factors caused other factors. The problem with this type of study using data is obviously pretty noisy because in practice, a lot of these variables are correlated with each other, and it's often very difficult to get a clear picture of the true isolated effects of one variable. Another thing that I learned about economics research is that a lot of these models are based on linear regressions, which mean that they are assuming a linear relationship between the independent variables and the outcome variable. This tends to be a simplifying assumption that loses some nuance about how these variables are operating in the real world, but the trade-off is that linear models are much easier to interpret and take action on. So I wanted to share some kind of dummy data to really drive this point home. In this toy example, we have our independent variable, which is floor area ratio, and we're trying to observe its correlation with number of residential units. And so there is some distribution of the data that we have, and you can see on the right, we have a nonlinear model, which is a much better fit to how the data actually moves. On the left, we have a linear model, which is not as good of a fit to the data, but it generally kind of follows the trend of the data. But the benefit of the linear model on the left is that you can say something very clear and interpretable, like for every 1 unit increase in floor area ratio, you get a 5 unit increase in residential units. Whereas you can't really make the same concise insight with the nonlinear model because the data behaves differently depending on which scale you're looking at. And so I really wanted to drive this point home of sometimes you can make this accuracy trade-off in order to get more interpretability. And oftentimes when you're trying to make policy decisions, interpretability matters more than accuracy. Another thing about economics, housing modeling, or really any sort of modeling is that it often starts with a lot of theory-driven assumptions, which are then used to build models that are then tested against reality using data. And as we all are probably familiar, one of the kind of cornerstones of economics theory is this idea of the mechanics of supply and demand. So if we're to think about the housing market in terms of supply and demand surges, then that means that rents should go up in accordance. But if rents go up, then over time, supply should also increase to counteract rents going up. And that means that eventually rents should go down in order to moderate the equilibrium. In theory, this is how the housing market should work. But in reality, in a city like New York, we are incredibly supply constrained, and supply is greatly overwhelmed by demand. This makes it really difficult to study the actual impacts of increasing supply on rents. There was a really good kind of research overview by the NYU Furman Center, and I highly recommend reading this. They reviewed the concept of supply skepticism and outlined a lot of arguments behind this philosophy. Supply skepticism is basically skepticism in the idea that increasing supply or increasing market rate supply specifically will actually lower rents. And so they did a review of a bunch of research on housing supply, and they found that market rate supply does lower rents, but supply needs to be increased at all levels of the income spectrum. So what that means is that you need to increase both market rate supply and affordable housing in order to lower rents. But notably, they don't offer recommendations on what degree of market rate supply and affordable housing you need or how to discover this ratio. And I think that's really that points to sort of a key gap in our methodology and our data is the lack of standardized rents data and kind of the time lag that it often takes to clearly understand the impacts of increasing supply on a housing market. Something else that I wanted to touch on, which is something that makes housing supply studies difficult in the context of causal inference, is this idea of endogeneity. So endogeneity in causal inference is if you are trying to study the impact of an X variable on a Y variable, there may be some other unobserved variable that is impacting both your X and Y variable. To make this more specific, let's say we are trying to investigate what is the impact of upzoning on rent prices. The problem with this question is that the decision to upzone is often not a random decision. Often the decision to upzone happens in areas that are already experiencing a surge in demand. So you may conduct the study and you may find that after upzoning, rent prices increased. But the problem here is that it's difficult to disentangle whether the rent prices increased because of the upzoning or because of the pre-existing demand in the area. There's a similar parallel here with why it's difficult to study the impacts of gentrification and displacement in neighborhoods, because similarly, you can observe that after a supply increase, displacement or gentrification increased, but you can't truly know if that was due to the supply increase or due to the pre-existing sort of gentrification forces in the area. So I noted down the titles of a couple of papers here that I found interesting, but overall, high level, after a review of these general supply studies, the takeaway is that supply is pretty difficult to study. Generally, these studies are varied across geographic location, time period, data source, methodology, etc., so they all capture slightly different slices of reality. The general consensus is that upzoning increases supply, but some studies find that increased supply lowers rents, and others find that increased supply increases rents. And the overarching point that I want to stress here is that one, economics theory stresses that an increase in supply should be followed by a decrease in prices. But in practice, whether or not an increase in supply truly lowers prices depends on both the magnitude of the supply increase and the magnitude of the pre-existing demand in the area. If the pre-existing demand or maybe the pre-existing kind of gentrification and displacement trends are too much for the supply effects to keep up with, as it often is in modern cities, then we won't truly be able to observe the rent lowering effects of the supply increase. I know that was a lot, and I can share this presentation later, but to not get overwhelmed by the details, the main takeaway that I gleaned from my research overview was that we definitely need more housing supply at all levels of the income spectrum, and we also need the supply at a great enough magnitude that it actually shows the positive rent lowering impacts. From all of the economics housing research, these are the variables that people typically look at when they're studying housing supply. So we have zoning, which includes floor area ratio, or things like ADUs and parking minimums. We have landmarks in historic districts. We have rent regulation. We have proximity to transit. We have tax abatements, things like the 421A program that offer tax subsidies in exchange for building more affordable housing. We have general factors in the construction market, things like labor availability, materials costs, permitting processes, etc. We have general community sentiment and community opposition, which may play a role in whether or not zoning changes get passed or may play a role in kind of impeding development. And then finally, we have other macroeconomic factors, things like inflation and interest rates that may also impact how much supply is able to be built. So again, taking a step back, coming back to my research journey at this point, having taken in all of this information, I realized that zoning is just one piece of the picture, and ultimately it's housing supply that we care about, and housing supply is impacted by all of these myriad factors. And so at this point, I became interested in studying all of the supply frictions rather than just zoning. And in order to do this, I decided to hone in on the Bloomberg era. The Bloomberg era was a period under Mayor Bloomberg from 2002 to 2013. And there are quite a lot of studies that cover the Bloomberg era. And the reason for this was at the time, it represented the largest number of city-initiated rezonings since the 1961 zoning resolution. And as a side note, there is quite a lot of contentiousness about the Bloomberg era because there were not only a lot of upzonings, but there are also a lot of downzonings and quite an inequitable distribution of where these upzonings and downzonings happened. But for the purposes of studying supply, or my question of like, how do we hone in on these frictions to housing supply, I decided to just focus on the areas that were upzoned during the Bloomberg era. So specifically, my research question was, given the neighborhoods that were upzoned by at least 20% during the Bloomberg era, what were the supply drivers and the supply frictions? So in order to do this, I used the Pluto dataset, the archives from 2004 to 2018, If you're not familiar, Pluto is basically a data set of all of the tax lots in the city. It includes information like zoning, number of residential units, and other sort of relevant features that we may be interested in. And I also used the zoning map amendments and the rent stabilized building list dataset. And the methodology that I used was I identified lots that were upzoned during the Bloomberg era using the Pluto and zoning maps. I extracted features that were relevant to housing supply that I identified in the previous slide that we might care about based on existing research. I aggregated these features to create a block level data set. And then I computed the deltas in these different variables from the year just before upzoning to 7 years after upzoning. And then I ran a linear regression with the dependent variable as percent change in residential units per block. This is an overview of the results of the regression. Generally, the coefficients describe the degree to which each of these variables change with the dependent variable, which is the percentage change in residential units. High-level takeaways from this is that residential density and number of landmark buildings on a block are both negatively correlated with how much supply increased. And this makes sense. You would think that blocks or buildings that are already pretty dense are less likely to be redeveloped or built out. And as we know, landmark buildings and historic districts also present a lot more kind of bureaucratic hurdles to redevelopment. Interestingly, the change in the degree of FAR, like this first variable, delta max FAR, was not a strong correlate with the percentage change in residential units. So, like the degree of upzoning basically wasn't strongly correlated with how many residential units were built. And this is probably because I was already only looking at all of the neighborhoods that were upzoned during the Bloomberg era. And so there may have been like other stronger forces, such as characteristics of the neighborhood or political climate, etc., other neighborhood varying characteristics that may have impacted the decision to build in one neighborhood over another that I'm not capturing here. So high level, the kind of the R squared is 0.05, which is pretty low. That means that these variables represent or are able to explain around 5.5% of the variation in my dependent variable. And I wouldn't hang my hat on this regression by any means. I think for me, this was more an exercise in really trying to understand the process by which you choose your variables. You start with theory, and then you try and augment and verify your assumptions using data. And I would probably extend this by trying to make this more of a causal analysis rather than a correlational analysis, and also incorporating more relevant variables. But really, the take home for me here was like, even with kind of a relatively simple linear model, there's still so much noise in the data and then difficulty in working with this data and really building a model that can lead you to come up with a clear conclusion. All right, so at this point, I run this rather humble regression, and now I'm wondering, how do I connect what I've learned here with this exercise of building a linear model to what methodologies it would actually take to get out of the housing crisis? For the rest of the talk, I'm going to take us through a thought experiment on this question. I want to start with some epistemic calibration, i.e., let's revisit what we've learned so far. So, what we're confident in is that increasing supply lowers rents if the supply increase is great enough. We also know that we are very supply constrained in New York City, which means that demand greatly outmatches supply. We know generally which variables are important in whether or not housing supply increases or decreases. What do we have some uncertainty about? The degree to which the construction market can facilitate a dramatic supply increase, and also the degree to which city infrastructure can support a dramatic supply increase. Now, to be fair, I spent relatively less time researching these two questions, but I also wasn't able to find as much research that is trying to model kind of the limits to which either the construction market factors or city infrastructure can actually handle a dramatic supply increase. So I'm willing to bet that we're generally pretty uncertain about this. We're also uncertain about what are the effects of building new supply on neighborhood displacement at every scale. It's pretty hard to study this problem because it's difficult to get clear signal on why people have left neighborhoods. And then finally, we're not sure how much rent regulation impacts housing supply and what the right balance of affordable housing to market rate housing is. And then finally, what we don't know, and this is self-evident, is what are the high confidence paths to unlocking the new scale of housing construction that's probably necessary to get out of the housing crisis. All right. So I think before we can continue this thought experiment even further, we need to come to an agreement on what getting out of the housing crisis even means. So as far as I can tell, there isn't like a kind of a gold standard agreed upon number of units that we need to build that people are claiming will get us out of the housing crisis. But there are a couple of metrics here that could be useful. So the first metric is vacancy rate, which we talked about before when talking about the housing emergency. So vacancy rate is basically the percentage of units that are vacant at any given time. And then the other metric is the percentage of the population that is rent burdened. So rent burden is basically defined as the if a household is spending 30% or more of income on rent, then that is defined as being rent burdened. And I haven't seen a target for a healthy housing market of the percentage of population that should be rent burdened. I do know that in 2023, I think the number was 52% of New Yorkers were rent burdened, which certainly seems too high. But one target that we do have is this definition of the housing emergency, which is, again, if you recall, if the vacancy rate is less than 5%, then that is the criteria for a housing emergency. For the purposes of, excuse me, for choosing some target, let's assume that the goal is to get the vacancy rate above 5%. Okay, this graph depicts the net new housing supply that has been built per year for the last 100 years. And this was taken from Jason Barr's blog, by the way. I highly recommend his blog for kind of a deep dive on all of these concepts. But anyway, this is examining net new housing supply per year for the past 100 years. And this black dotted line denotes when the vacancy rate has been 5%. Based on this graph, we can conclude when the vacancy rate has been around 5%, that's also when we've been building around 20 new units per 1,000 housing units a year, or 2%. So put another way, in order to get to a vacancy rate of 5%, we would have to be increasing our housing stock by 2%. And in terms of concrete numbers, what that means is that we'd basically need to build around 74,000 units a year based on the size of our current housing stock. And over 15 years, that would amount to around 1 million housing units. For reference, in 2023, we built 30,000 housing units, and the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is estimated on the high end to account for 5,500 additional new units a year. So again, theoretical target is around 74,000, and currently we are projected to be around half of that. And something else notable from this graph is the last time we were actually at this desired rate for a sustained period of time was 1931 and before. So what is the punchline here? I guess it's clear that we need to unlock a new housing reality, like a new scale of housing construction that we haven't actually seen in the past 100 years. And to me, I think this implies that the mechanics or the kind of dynamics of that target reality's housing market are going to be quite different than the mechanics and dynamics of our current day housing market. So at this point, what I'm wondering is, given that our target reality is so different than our current one, what does that imply in terms of what methodology and modeling techniques it would actually take to guide us towards that reality, to make the kind of bold policy decisions with higher confidence that we need to get into that very different scale of housing construction? So, to revisit what we have methodologically, so currently the way that we understand the housing market is by using linear models. And linear models, again, are good for very interpretable insights, but only on asking very specific and scoped questions. The problem with linear models is that as the phenomena that you're trying to model becomes more complex, the less reliable linear models become at capturing the true patterns in the data. So, to combat this, we could build more complex models that capture maybe nonlinear dynamics or complex and more nuanced patterns in the variables that we're studying. But the trade-off is as these models become more complex, they also become less interpretable, meaning there are less actionable insights that we can take based on them, more or less. So, examples of more complex modeling techniques that are used in machine learning or economics research include deep learning, which implicitly learns patterns and interactions between a very high number of variables, or agent-based modeling in economics, where you encode rules for how agents in a system might behave and then calibrate these rules based on historical data and then run simulations to analyze policy interventions. So we could do all of this work to implement these much more complex and rich and nuanced models to represent our current reality. But there's another layer to why employing complex models would be a difficult and tricky exercise in this scenario. So I'm trying to use this graph as a kind of visual analogy to explain why. So this is a graph describing one variable, but we can imagine extrapolate this to a scenario like our housing market, which involves many more variables that are interacting in much more complex ways. So the blue data represents the data that we currently have about our housing market. And let's say that we trained a very good complex model on the data that we currently have about our housing market. The underlying problem here is that since we require a new scale of housing development in order to leave the housing crisis, one which we haven't really seen in around 100 years, it's a pretty fair assumption that the mechanisms of that reality will undoubtedly be different than our current one, which makes it much more difficult to model that reality given data about our current one. So in this visual, the orange data represents that new scale of development. So at this scale, maybe new emergent dynamics might start to take place. For example, the construction market or labor markets might start to operate in completely different ways that aren't reflected in the data that we have about our current housing market. And even though we have this really good complex model, it still fails to predict the dynamics of this kind of new scale reality. Ultimately, I know this is all pretty abstract, but the point that I'm trying to drive home is that models are reflections of patterns in data ultimately. And if the only data that we have reflects a very different reality than the one that we're trying to get to, then the model can only take us so far. So it may be unfaithful to the complexity of the problem of the housing market to try and fully model the reality in which we build 1 million housing units from the get-go. Personally, I don't believe that there's some sort of silver bullet methodology or modeling exercise that's going to tell us the right combination of variables that will allow us to get out of the housing crisis from the point that we're in now. So if it doesn't make sense to improve our model complexity, then what can we do? The one lever that we do have is to increase our degree of reactivity. So what I mean by this is we continue to use the same simpler linear models and more interpretable methodologies that we have today, but we employ them in a way where we increase the frequency at which we're measuring reality. The difference between our world today and our world 80 to 100 years ago is that one, we have a lot more data about our reality. Two, we have a lot more tools that can help us digest and understand the data faster. And three, our political climate is a lot more favorable towards the understanding that we need more comprehensive and data-driven regional planning. So for a lot of the housing policy changes that have been enacted in the past 100 years that we talked about, the feedback loop to realize their consequences has been decades long. Like the fact that we are still understanding and experiencing the consequences of the 1961 downzoning 60 years later. We don't have to live in that world anymore. What I'm suggesting here isn't necessarily some super revolutionary new modeling technique, but rather it's a more specific philosophy about how to orient ourselves towards truth and uncertainty and how to act in the situation. So, one, it's to recognize the order of magnitude of construction and change that we will need to get out of the housing crisis. Two, it's to recognize the degree of complexity of the changes necessary. And three, it's to commit to making iterative decisions based on scoped, interpretable questions that are answerable by simple models, and then using those observations of those outcomes to further refine our policy choices in the feedback loop that this graphic describes. I recognize that was all, again, very abstract. Here's a more specific and grounded example of what this could look like using our existing tools and methods. I was inspired by this paper, the title of which I put at the top. They basically used LLMs to estimate the likely distributions of target variables based on messy, unstructured data and then use that for causal inference. Specifically, they used LLMs to look at Reddit posts about the effects of a certain medication, and they asked the LLM to estimate the likelihood of that medication working conditional on the text of the Reddit post. Then they used those resulting distributions for causal inference analyses, and their accuracy ended up being actually quite close to the outcomes of randomized controlled clinical trials. So they propose in their paper that their method can be used in the future for kind of initial coarse-grained explanation analyses before deciding to actually conduct clinical trials. So in a similar vein, what I'm proposing here is that we can utilize LLMs and causal inference for a coarse-grained analysis of policy impacts. So specifically, in the months and years following City of Yes, we can inspect data streams like the Department of Buildings job applications data, which construction permits are getting approved, and then we can also utilize community board meeting transcripts and city council hearing transcripts to build a signal on the level of community opposition to development that's happening or any negative or unintended consequences of development that's happening. And from the construction permitting data, we can use LLMs to assign the likelihood that each kind of new change is related to a specific type of zoning mechanism in the City of Yes. And even though these signals may ultimately be pretty high uncertainty, we can still use them to build a initial causal analysis about which zoning mechanisms in City of Yes are actually having the greatest impact. And then we can use that to inform which zoning mechanisms we need to drill down on for future policy changes. So the goal might be over the course of the year to repeat this process and build a higher confidence signal on the order of magnitude impacts of all of these different zoning mechanisms that we've employed. So again, none of this is like revolutionary new techniques, and certainly people might be doing this analysis already or be will be doing this analysis in the year following the City of Yes changes. But really, what I'm advocating for is using all of the data at our disposal, all of the data possible at our disposal, even if they produce high uncertainty signals, so that we can shorten the feedback loop of what the outcomes of our policy changes are from decades to months and years. And this is what I'm claiming is actually going to allow us to build a tractable path forward to a significantly different housing reality. All right. So, in conclusion, when I first set out to investigate how far data can take us, it was based on this like technocratic impulse or this idea that there might exist a super complex and interesting modeling technique that can solve the housing and zoning puzzle for once. But instead, what I realized is that this problem is really too complex for any single all-encompassing model to capture perfectly. And in fact, this is not a practical way at all to justify policy changes. So instead, what I've come to realize, the opinion that I currently hold, is that the road out of the housing crisis will have to involve a very coarse-grained and iterative approach to understanding reality. I also want to touch on the fact that I recognize I did not really go into the reality of what it actually takes to create policy. And that's because that is a very complex subject in and of itself. But also, I think it's valuable to be able to go through this thought experiment of in an idealized world where we can create whatever policies we want to, how would we actually think about this problem from a data and methodology perspective? And that's really what I'm trying to share here. So, in conclusion, will getting out of the housing crisis be difficult? Yes, absolutely. But we can be bold and adopt a framework in which we use all of the data and all of the tools and all of the methodologies at our disposal to their full advantage. So that's it. I know that was a lot, and we have a few minutes before 5, so I want to open the floor to any burning questions people may have. But also, I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and I'm really eager to continue the conversation with people. If you have any questions, feedback, please shoot me a note. But yeah, any questions? I also want to say I'm just now looking at the chat and seeing that there are quite a few questions that came through. I was not looking at these during my presentation, so sorry about that. Does anyone have any questions, though, that they want to ask live?
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any data on population, recent, not 2020 census on New York City?
I'm sure that data is out there, but I haven't looked at it myself.
Okay. You've been exploring these topics. I think there's a lot of people who are data scientists that are participating. I like to bring my view as a person who has been involved in development and development sites and currently the LIC1 plan. The problem is it takes about 3 years. I'm also expedited with DLB to actually conceptualize and build a building and have it finished. And it takes a lot now because we don't have much land left. And when they do rezone the manufacturing land to residential, it's not affordable. It's based on MIH. And it's happening right now in the plan for Lion City, which is getting certified by IRLIP and City Planning. So there's a lot of problems in between then, and what is affordable to the neighborhood? As every year they build more and more skyscrapers and bring in more higher income levels, you're not going to have affordable. Because I did a little study myself, and when the rents went up, the income went up like about 10,000 per year since they rezoned this entire area. So finally, it has to be a cookie cutter system where you're going to build buildings, have plans approved. And at that rate, I study it with another person. It should be about 18 months to 24 months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the time lag for actually seeing construction happening, that's a very fair point. In the example that I showed, I think there's a way that we could use unstructured data sources to get some sort of initial signal about the likelihood of development construction. And that's what I was getting at. Like, even if we can have a rather low confidence signal of the supply increase, we can still have something from the data that we do have in order to build a prior about what policy changes are doing. That being said, at a high level, there's a ton of nuance to this problem. This is obviously a huge problem, and there are like a lot of different ways that the reality of new construction can play out on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And my goal with this presentation was, obviously I can't cover all of the nuance involved in researching a problem like this, but it was more about how do you build a mental framework for even starting to approach research in this space. Yeah, that's what I'll say in response.
Thank you.
Yeah, Julia and then Martin.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, because I'm also like not a housing expert, but I am like very interested in the topic. And I was recently reading Capital City by Samuel Stein, and he points out this, and I thought this was like a very clever idea because he's talking about supply and demand. And he talks about how supply and demand doesn't really work because there are different markets, and how you're only building for the one market, but the demand is for another, the existing demand is for another market. And also the fact that it's not a closed loop. So you're bringing in wealthy people that aren't already living in New York. So I was just wondering if in your analysis, you considered breaking down the different markets, or if you maybe had a reason to not do that. Just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think what that reminds me of is this idea of the conclusion of the supply skepticism study by the Furman Center, which is basically encouraging, like, we need more supply at every level of the income spectrum. And I know that the vacancy rates also differ quite greatly based on the level of the income spectrum that we're looking at. So yeah, that's a fair point. I think it would be a good next step to conduct this analysis differently, controlling for which part of the income spectrum that we're looking at. Martin?
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciated the talk. This was super interesting. Just as a side note before my question, I think Evan Mast from the Upjohn Institute has actually done some research on like when new luxury housing is constructed, how that shifts housing incentives for everybody across different quintiles. I'd just been looking at that before this, so worth checking out to Julia's question. I was actually just curious if you've posted this on GitHub anywhere, particularly the data sets that you used and the wrangling and kind of your initial model here, because I'd be super curious to check it out.
Yeah, so on the event page, there's a link to a Google Drive, and I put all my sources there. Anyone else have a question that they want to talk about?
I'm just curious what your plans are moving forward with this research, where you're planning to take it next, if you are.
Yeah, so the kind of LLM-driven causal analysis or causal inference process that I presented, that's like a very scrappy initial idea. So I want to explore that more and think about what's possible and what's not possible there. Also, part of my motivation for giving this talk was like connecting with other people who are doing research in this space. Please reach out to me if you want to collaborate on this research, or if you have any other feedback or kind of questions on these topics.
Janita, I just wanted to say this is really great. I missed like the first 5 minutes. I missed your initial background. I was curious how you came to this as a study and a project.
Yeah, I took a course last fall called Foundations of New York City. It's put on by this independent civic school called Maximum New York, and it's basically like a crash course on New York City government.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm familiar with them. I haven't participated in their stuff, but read a fair amount of stuff on them.
Cool. Yeah, so that's what initially piqued my interest on zoning and the complexity of the housing market. But yes, something else that I said in the beginning was I'm not an expert in housing policy or economics or data science. All of this was from the vantage point of a newcomer to these domains trying to figure out how exactly to think about it.
I think it's also important because there's so much information and there's so many strong positions. So I'm in the School of Data tomorrow, and I'm on a panel that's going to be myself and two other PhD students at the CUNY Graduate Center talking about affordable housing. And none of us are like data scientists or computational researchers. I'm actually a social worker as my background, but like I've taught classes on social policy and worked in supportive housing for quite a while. So it's interesting, right? There's like multi-dimensional perspectives on housing, which is so fundamental to the world that we live in and so contentious, and people have very strong views, right? I appreciate your emphasizing the supply side skepticism, right? Because I think there is this kind of folk model of supply and demand, right? Folk economic theories.
Yeah. The contentiousness aspect is definitely notable when you listen to the testimony and like city council hearings, but that is counterbalanced by the fact that we have to do something to get out of the housing crisis. How do we reconcile these two things? How do we even begin to agree on a solution? It's one thing to know where we're going and then take all the effort to get there, but if we don't even know where to go, then it's like a intractable problem.
Yeah. A wicked problem.
Sorry to interrupt. This is Virginia. Hi, thank you so much for that. It's so interesting. I'm not a data scientist whatsoever, but I come from the experience of having lived in a building with basically a predatory real estate investor who uses private equity. And what they do is they only buy up buildings that have a lot of rent stabilized tenants in them. And then they try and force the tenants out with construction and lead, dust, and asbestos and terrible treatment, and accusing people of not actually living there and having another home. There's all these loopholes. Like I've even heard of landlords buying roach kits and introducing roach kits and mice kits and stuff like that into these buildings. So their business is actually to buy and sell buildings. And in order to do that, they have to increase the value of each property they buy, and to do it very quickly, which is what's called their return on investment. When you look at a market wide, you can say that it's based on natural market forces, but when private equity buys up multifamily properties, they're not actually engaging in natural market forces. They're actually using weaknesses and the loopholes in city agency rules and regulations in order to actually do whatever they need to do to get as many tenants out and convert those buildings into market rate apartments. Like in this building, they bought the building and they started trying to push people out and started construction without any notification. And it was really super dangerous. And then that's when I started doing research and taking classes on the New York housing business. And I started understanding actually what it was, how this business model works. And then I started getting into the DOB data and stuff like that. And I found out that over 90% of the DOB building permits that my landlord applied for, they lied and said no tenants lived in the building at all. And there were no rent stabilized tenants, and that no asbestos would be disturbed. So these are the kinds of things. It took 3 years for DOB to actually catch up and actually fine them for doing that. But in the meantime, I think at that point there were like 12 gutted apartments. So there's all kinds of loopholes. And I guess without going on and on about my personal experience, I think it's just important to understand that each building in this model is a business. I was listening, Ezra Klein has a new book out. Oh God, what's it called? Do you guys know the name of the new book by Ezra Klein?
Abundance.
Yeah, Abundance, which I haven't read yet, but I've been listening to him talking about it. And he was using like what you said, Ian, was like almost like a folklorish like sense of supply and demand. And he was saying, if you look at housing, it's like musical chairs, and there's only 10 chairs, and there are 11 or 12 people looking for housing. And so when the music stops, the person that's vulnerable or has a drug addiction or doesn't have a job or has a broken leg can't get to a chair in time, and they're out. And I just really want to send him a note at the New York Times and say, each chair is a business. And that business can decide if they want anyone to sit on that chair, and they can figure out a way to push anyone off of that chair. You know, there are other forces going on that are not just data. It's qualitative data. And there are so many people like on the ground in these properties, or who are organizing tenants around this kind of stuff that can actually probably help to expand your understanding of how the data points relate to the quantitative data relates to the qualitative data, which is about the extent of my data literacy. Do you know what I mean? But it's like between all of us, we have a lot of information. And one of the things I said at NYC Data last year, when the Furman Center gave a presentation, and I said a lot of the data is lagging because a lot of the landlords don't actually admit how well their buildings are doing and how each of these businesses are actually making so much money. And I said, we should just go to the finance data, like at the comptroller's office, and you will be able to see the buildings that traditionally have had a very slow increase in property value. If you look at that trend, you will see that the buildings that have gotten rid of tenants really quickly, the property values have gone up, and that means their property taxes, the assessed property taxes have gone up like really fast. And she looked at me and she was like, oh my God, like she gave me her card. She's like, that is really smart. But I'm not that smart. It's just that I started digging.